It had been days since I first uncovered the truth about the trust. Days spent brooding over the sharp sting of betrayal, like an open wound that refused to heal. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faces of my parents, their smiles pretending warmth while their eyes hid the coldness of manipulation. My hands trembled as I reread the will, the trust document, and the lawyer's notes. My mind refused to accept the reality that had slowly begun to settle in. I could feel my stomach twist into knots, a constant reminder of the battle raging inside me. I was hurt, no, I was destroyed. The foundation of everything I had known had cracked. The people who were supposed to protect me, love me, had done the exact opposite. I wasn't a child anymore, but in that moment, I felt small, trapped, betrayed by those I thought I could trust. The people who should have been the first to offer solace and support were now the ones standing in the way of my future. How could they do this to me? How could they turn away, turn their backs on me when I needed them most? It wasn't just the money, the inheritance that hurt. It was the manipulation, the control. They had treated me like a puppet pulling strings from behind the curtain, their motivations clear only when it was too late. The realization hit me like a freight train. They'd always known. They'd always planned this. My grandmother's kindness had been nothing more than a threat to their ambitions. The worst part was how they had kept it hidden. My entire life had been a lie, a carefully constructed narrative where I was the good son, the obedient child, the one who always came second. But now, after everything, it was clear. I had never mattered to them. I stared out the window of my apartment, the city's lights flickering like distant stars in the night sky. The wind outside whispered, carrying the faint scent of rain. But inside, all I could smell was the thick, suffocating cloud of betrayal. I was suffocating, and the worst part was the hollowness, the emptiness. No matter what I did, the anger, the rage, the sadness, none of it was enough to fill the void that had opened up between me and my parents. The way she had always made me feel safe, that was what haunted me now. I could hear her voice, a distant echo in my mind, calling me back to the person I'd been before the world became so complicated. She had always told me that family was everything. But now, I wasn't sure if I even knew what family meant anymore. I thought back to the last time I had been with her, when she was still healthy, when we had sat together on the porch, watching the sunset. Her eyes had been so full of warmth, so full of wisdom. She had spoken to me like I was the only person who mattered in the world, and for the first time, I had felt seen. I had been her person, her confidant. I remembered the way she held my hand as if to remind me that I was never alone. But now, looking back, I saw the cracks in their smiles, their hollow promises, their whispered conversations when they thought I wasn't listening. The memories cut deeper than I had realized. The house was supposed to be a sanctuary for me, a place where I felt loved, where my presence was wanted. But now it felt like a prison, a constant reminder of what had been stolen from me. And yet, as painful as these memories were, they also pushed me forward. I had been given a gift, a chance to change things. The trust wasn't just a lifeline. It was a weapon. The truth about my parents, about their lies, was so much darker than I had imagined. As I dug deeper, I uncovered more. Whispers of a deal they had made long before Grandma's death. A deal that ensured their future. Their wealth. It was never about family. It was about power control. They had manipulated everything. My grandmother had always known what they were capable of. She had known the depths of their greed and ambition. That was why she had left the trust for me, to protect me, to make sure I had the power to fight back when the time came. But they had built walls around that power, making sure it was out of my reach. The truth burned like acid. The foundation I had built my entire identity upon, my family, my roots, was built on lies. Everything I had ever been taught about loyalty, love, and trust felt like a sick joke now. They had created a narrative where I was the ideal child, the one who would one day take over their empire. But they never had any intention of letting me be free. I needed to find a way to break free from their control. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me, waiting for me to make a move. Every time I entered their house for the family gatherings, I felt the coldness in the air, the distance between us widening with every glance. I wasn't the same anymore. I was no longer the obedient child they had raised. I had tasted the bitterness of their betrayal, and I couldn't go back. I couldn't allow them to manipulate me any longer. As I pored over the trust documents one last time, I saw something I'd missed before. A small clause buried deep within the legal jargon. It was a loophole, a crack in their carefully constructed world of control. If I could prove my worth, if I could show that I was capable of making my own decisions, the trust could be released to me early. I could already feel the anger bubbling up again. This was it. This was my chance to take control of my future, to expose their lies and force them to face the consequences of their actions. But something still held me back, doubt, uncertainty. Part of me still wanted to hold on to the hope that they could change, that maybe, just maybe, they didn't mean to hurt me. But that part was fading. It was dying, suffocated by the truth. The first few steps felt almost impossible, too risky. But as I thought back on the way my parents had treated me over the years, the way they had pushed me aside, I realized that I had nothing left to lose. It was time to take matters into my own hands. No more hiding in the shadows, no more pretending that everything was fine. I needed to expose the truth. I needed to make them see that they couldn't control me anymore. But as I prepared to make my move, I couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness inside me. The anger I had felt so strongly in the beginning was still there, but it was tempered now. I wasn't acting out of pure vengeance anymore. I was acting because I had no other choice. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about reclaiming my life. I couldn't change what had already happened. I couldn't bring my grandma back, but I could change the course of my future. And I would for her, for me, for the person I was determined to become, no matter the cost. With a heavy heart, I made my decision. I was going to fight for the trust. I was going to expose their lies. I was going to take back what was mine. But even as I steeled myself for what was to come, I couldn't escape the hollow feeling in my chest. No matter how much I wanted revenge, a small part of me still loved them. And that made it so much harder to follow through with my plan. The path ahead was dark, and the weight of the decision hung heavily on me. But I had made up my mind. I would expose them, and I would make them pay. The countdown to my revenge had begun. But as I stood there at the precipice of everything I had ever known, I realized that the hardest part wasn't the revenge itself, it was living with the consequences of what I was about to do. The days leading up to the final revelation were the darkest I had ever known. I had lived through the initial shock, the numbness that followed the discovery of the trust, and the searing anger that had driven me to take those first steps toward reclaiming what was mine. But now, standing on the precipice of everything, it felt like I was losing myself to the very thing that had once been a source of hope, my plan for revenge. The stillness in my apartment seemed almost suffocating, the weight of my decisions pressing down on me with every passing minute. Each room felt smaller, colder, as though the walls were closing in on me. I could feel the pull of the past, the memories of Grandma, of a time before betrayal had tainted everything. And yet, the anger I had once felt now burned with a deeper intensity. It was no longer about them, about my parents and their lives. It was about me. I had to see this through. But even as the rage surged within me, a part of me, the part that still held on to the idea of family, felt conflicted. Was I doing the right thing? Was this really the only way to fight back? The doubts began to creep in like dark tendrils, threatening to undo everything I had worked toward. The reality of what I was about to do sank in deeper. The consequences. The collateral damage. And yet, there was no turning back now. I had already crossed too many lines. I had already exposed the cracks in my parents' perfect facade. The lie was unraveling, and as much as they wanted to keep their hold on the truth, they were losing control. But as each layer of their deception peeled away, so did the last vestiges of my connection to them. It was like watching a beautiful, fragile structure collapse in slow motion, each piece falling into place with the inevitable finality of a shattered dream. I thought about the last time I had felt whole before everything fell apart. I could still picture Grandma's warm smile, her voice filled with wisdom and love. She had been the one person in my life who had never let me down. But now, as I revisited our shared moments, I realized the weight of her loss was more profound than I had understood. She had been more than a grandmother. She had been my moral compass, my shelter from the storm. But with her gone, the world I had known no longer made sense. And It was then that I understood the painful truth. The trust wasn't just a financial asset, it was the key to my survival. But even as I fought to hold on to the memory of her, the foundation I had once built my life upon was crumbling. But now that trust was gone, replaced by the ugly reality of their manipulation, I could feel the weight of their betrayal suffocating me like a thick fog in my lungs. My body felt heavy, my thoughts disjointed. The more I thought about their actions, the more it hurt. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was deeply ingrained in everything they had ever done. They had shaped me into a person who was loyal to them, obedient to their every command, and in return, I had been promised a place in their world, a place that was now denied to me. A place they had kept for themselves, built on the foundation of my sacrifices. I was trapped. There was no escaping the web they had woven around me. But in that suffocating moment, the truth became clear. I had two choices: accept their betrayal and live as nothing more than a pawn in their game, or fight. Fighting meant losing everything. It meant walking away from a life I had known, leaving behind the remnants of a family that no longer existed. The idea of revenge, of truly dismantling everything they had worked for, was terrifying. But what terrified me more was the thought of doing nothing. What kind of person would I be if I just let them continue to control me, to rob me of my future? I could already hear the voices in my head, the words of my grandmother, urging me to stand strong, to be the person she knew I could be. But the truth was, I didn't know who I was anymore. My entire identity had been shaped by lies, by the very people who were supposed to protect me. The emotional turmoil raged inside me like a storm that couldn't be contained. The uncertainty gnawed at my mind. I wasn't sure if I was still capable of feeling anything other than rage and sorrow. But there was one thing I knew. I could no longer live in the shadow of my parents' lies. I had to break free. I began to formulate my plan, piece by piece, knowing that each decision would lead me further down a path I couldn't turn back from. The more I thought about my parents, the more I realized that they were not the people I had once believed them to be. They were manipulative, self-serving, willing to do whatever it took to maintain their grip on power. But I was no longer that naive child who had believed in their image of perfection. My plan wasn't just about taking back what was mine. It was about taking back my life. It was about showing them that I wasn't afraid anymore, that I would no longer be controlled. But even as I plotted, I felt a deep sadness settle over me. This wasn't just about exposing their lies. It was about dismantling everything they had ever been, everything I had ever known. And the weight of that responsibility was almost unbearable. In the midst of the turmoil, there were moments, brief, fleeting moments, when I remembered who I used to be. A time before the anger, before the betrayal had taken root. A time when I believed in family, when I believed that love and loyalty could conquer anything. Those memories were sharp and painful, like a wound that refused to heal. They reminded me of a version of myself that no longer existed, a version that had been erased by the actions of the very people who were supposed to love me. But those memories, as painful as they were, also fueled the fire inside me. They reminded me of why I was doing this. I wasn't just seeking revenge for the sake of it. I was doing it for the person I used to be, the person I was determined to become again. I was reclaiming my future, my freedom. The first steps of my plan fell into place, and with each action, I could feel the power shift. But it wasn't easy. Every step I took to expose my parents' lies brought a wave of guilt and sorrow. I found myself wondering if I was doing the right thing, if this was really the path I needed to follow. Was revenge worth the cost? Would it be enough to heal the pain, to make the betrayal go away? As I prepared to take the final step, the moment that would expose everything, I paused. A deep sense of reflection washed over me. The room was silent, save for the sound of my own heartbeat thudding in my chest. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to think beyond the revenge, beyond the plan. I thought about Grandma. I thought about the love she had shown me, the way she had believed in me when no one else had. And in that moment, the decision became clear. This wasn't just about making my parents pay. It was about honoring Grandma's memory, about fighting for the future she had hoped I would have. But the decision to move forward with my plan didn't come without a cost. My heart ached, and the weight of what I was about to do settled heavily on my shoulders. I wasn't just fighting for justice. I was severing the last ties to a family that no longer existed. But the truth was, I had no other choice. I had to take control of my future, even if it meant leaving everything behind. I stood in the silence, taking a deep breath, the weight of my decision hanging in the air. There was no going back now. With a steady resolve, I knew what I had to do. The path to revenge was set, but the cost would be higher than I could ever have imagined. And even as I prepared to take that final step, I knew that the emotional toll would linger long after the revenge was exacted. The story wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. And what came next would shape the rest of my life. The phone call came like a thunderclap in the middle of an ordinary gray Thursday evening, and I felt the world stop spinning. I'd been sitting alone in my small, dimly lit apartment, the only noise the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional rustling of papers scattered across my desk. The phone rang and I answered without thinking, expecting it to be a bill collector or an old friend I hadn't spoken to in months. But when I heard the voice on the other end, my stomach dropped. "Your grandma ... she's gone." The words were slow, careful, and broken, but I didn't need any more explanation. I knew exactly what they meant. My grandma, my rock, the one constant in my life, was gone. And as much as I wanted to sob and collapse on the floor, I couldn't. Not yet. Wanted to get to the hospital. I had to be there. She deserved that, and I owed her that. She had been there for me when no one else had. But then came the second part of the call, the part that would alter everything. "They won't let you in. Your name? Your parents are there, and they've made it clear that they don't want you there." I stood frozen, the phone gripped in my hand, my mouth dry. It felt like someone had just punched me in the chest. My grandma had spent years as my caregiver. She had taken me in when my parents had been too busy, too consumed with their own lives to notice me. She had been there through every heartbreak, every hardship. And yet, when it came time for me to be there for her at the very end, May shut me out. The shock was overwhelming, but even more devastating was the realization that this wasn't a sudden act of cruelty. This was planned, carefully orchestrated, and I had never seen it coming. My parents had always been distant, emotionally unavailable, caught up in their own world, but this was different. The betrayal hit deep, like a cold blade driven into the very foundation of my trust. How could they? How could they do this to me? I hung up the phone, my hands trembling. I sat down on the couch, but I could hardly breathe. My mind raced. I replayed the phone call over and over in my head, trying to make sense of it. They had to know how much Grandma meant to me. They had to know how much I wanted to be by her side, to say goodbye. Yet they had banned me from even being in the same room as her. The injustice of it was suffocating. And then the flood of memories started. I remembered the long summer evenings spent on the porch of Grandma's house, the warm, golden glow of the sun setting over the backyard as we talked about life, about everything. She always made me feel like I was enough, like I mattered. Even when my parents were too busy to pay attention, she was there. She understood me in a way no one else did. I remembered the times I would crawl into bed beside her, hiding from the world and seeking comfort in her presence. She was my safe place, my protector. But now with the weight of her death pressing on me, I realized something terrible. My parents had never truly loved me in the way she had. They had always been distant, always more focused on their image, their status. I had never been enough for them. I was just an afterthought, a burden to be dealt with when necessary. But it wasn't just the betrayal that hurt, it was the sheer finality of it. I would never get another chance to speak to her, to tell her how much I loved her, to thank her for everything she had done for me. The finality of her death, combined with the cruelty of my parents, tore at something deep inside me. My sense of self, my foundation was crumbling. I wanted to scream. I wanted to lash out, but all I could do was sit in the silence, feeling the weight of everything I had lost. The days that followed were a blur. The funeral was cold and mechanical. My parents stood at the center, playing their roles as grieving children, but I could see through the facade. They weren't mourning her, they were mourning the loss of their power. Grandma had always been the one who held the family together. But now she was gone, and they would be forced to deal with the consequences of their actions. I wasn't invited to the wake. They kept me at arm's length as though I were a stranger. And as I stood alone outside the church after the ceremony, I knew it would never be the same. Not with my parents, not with anyone. The next day, I received the letter from the lawyer. The will, I hadn't expected anything, but what I found inside would change everything. It was my grandmother's will, a formal document stating how her assets and property were to be distributed. I had assumed she had left everything to my parents after all. They were her children, and that's what was expected. But there, hidden among the pages, was something I hadn't anticipated. She had left me a trust. Not just any trust, but a significant one. One that would provide for me financially for the rest of my life. Money, security, everything I could ever need. But there was a catch. The trust would remain under my parents' control until I turned 30, a full decade before I could access any of it. I could hardly believe what I was reading. Grandma had left me something extraordinary, something that would allow me to build a life on my own terms. But my parents had complete control over it. They could decide when and how I could access it, and they would make sure I stayed dependent on them for as long as possible. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about money. This was about control. And my parents had used their power to manipulate and dominate every part of my life. They had turned me into a puppet, and now, even in death, they held the strings. The anger swelled within me. The betrayal stung. But it wasn't enough to break me. No. I would make sure that I got what was mine. I would find a way to take control, to get the trust released before my parents could suffocate me with it. But more than that, I would expose the truth. I began to dig. I started researching every detail of the trust, the will, and anything else that might give me leverage. The more I dug, the more I began to understand my parents' true motives. They had always been power-hungry, always willing to do whatever it took to maintain control. This trust, this legacy, was just another pawn in their twisted game. And that's when I realized something even darker. The betrayal wasn't just a personal attack. It was calculated. They had manipulated everything my entire life. My relationship with my grandmother, the way they had driven a wedge between us. All of it had been done to ensure that I would never be able to stand on my own. I wasn't going to let them get away with it. Not this time. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't fight them directly, not yet, but I could wait. I could play the game better than they ever could. I would make them reveal themselves, piece by piece. I would expose their lies, their manipulation, and their greed. I would make sure they understood the true cost of their betrayal. But even as I plotted my next steps, I carried a heavy heart. The truth was, I still loved them. No matter how much they had hurt me, they were still my parents. And that made this so much harder. But I knew deep down that the only way forward was to tear down the walls they had built around me, brick by brick. And as I stood there, looking at the trust documents in my hands, I made a vow to myself. I would get what was rightfully mine. And I would make them pay for what they had done. The anger inside me burned hotter, fiercer than ever before. The path to revenge had begun, but in my heart, I knew it would come at a cost. And the hardest part would be living with the consequences of my own actions.